Hey everybody, welcome back to the Vortex Edge podcast. Jimmy here, and I'm joined by instructor Brennan. We're going to talk pistol stuff. And more specifically, before you really get into the really awesome pistol stuff, we're going to do a very important process and make sure that our pistol, and we're assuming that you have followed along with the modern wave and the rest of us by having a red dot on your pistol. So that's the running assumption here throughout this episode, making sure that everything is sighted in and properly functioning together. And Brennan, the sight-in process for a pistol with a red dot, maybe it gets overthought, maybe it gets underthought at times. You know, a lot of people are still getting used to the idea of a red dot on a pistol.
Right.
Where does one start? I mean, first off, just with equipment and things like that. Like, where do they need to be in order to begin the process of shooting?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I like to look for is just making sure, like, my red dot is mounted correctly, right? Because if it's not mounted correctly, or your screws are backing out or something like that, when you go to actually zero, you could get, like, some wobble, or your optic comes loose or something like that, and obviously you're just chasing kind of yourself, kind of like a dog chasing its own tail. You're not going to get consistent group. So mounting that up correctly, generally what I look for is looking to the manufacturer of the red dot, what torque specs they recommend, making sure that I like blue Loctite my screws, things like that. So just kind of some overall, like, it's really boring to break out the manual and see what the manufacturer recommends, but doing that will, set you up for success.
Right. Yeah, I think you brought up, for example, like using a little blue Loctite on the screws. It's funny because there's times when in optic mounting we don't like using blue Loctite on screws, and then we do like using them in other instances. One of the areas I feel like it's funny that we're harping on this because you're thinking, well, yeah, I tighten the optic down, I just don't want it to fall off. That's pretty obvious. And yet still we see in classes and in other areas where people's optics fall right off the gun. And you have a few different layers at times, like if you have a Glock MOS or a Smith & Wesson Shield or, any of the other plate, not Shield, what is it? What do they call theirs? Core.
Yep.
Thanks. So Core, they have a plate system. So you got to tighten the correct plate down to the gun itself, and you don't want that to come loose. And then you have to tighten the optic down to the plate, and you don't want that to come loose from there. So there's a couple of sandwiching items. Do you put blue Loctite a little bit on all those fasteners, or is there specific ones?
Yeah, so the Glock MOS system works like that. So the plate actually screws down into the slide itself, and then the optic screws into the plate, and it's not actually directly tapping into the slide.
Okay.
The Smith & Wesson core kind of platform is a little bit different in that the plate is actually kind of just like a shim, and then those screws actually tap directly in, so you only do have one set of screws for those. But like with something like the Glock MOS system, which is their modular optic system, I have typically done red Loctite in the past for the mounting plate. I don't think that's necessary, but in my experience, I had those back off a few times where my actual optic was secured to the plate, and then the plate was moving. So that's kind of up for debate. I really don't like that to move because that's the basis of my red dot itself. But you should be just fine with blue.
Okay, got it. So yeah, getting that all set up right off the bat is very important. Now, when it comes to the shooting, we'll move on to the more exciting stuff. What should somebody's setup look like? I'm talking the target, the distance, stuff like that when they're starting to zero in. The other confusing thing, which I'm sure we'll get to as well, is when you look at rifles, you can bore sight them. We can't really do that very easily with a striker fired pistol. Like, what's the plan?
Right. So, couple things I think of note just as you're starting out, right? First of all, when we're zeroing a red dot, I'm going to zero the dot completely independently of my iron sights.
Ooh,
okay?
yes.
So my iron sights, everybody thinks that if you buy a gun and it has iron sights on them, that they are necessarily like just dead on, right, from the factory at, generally they assume any given distance they're shooting, right? The thing is with iron-sighted pistols, especially the iron sights on top, right, like a lot of times those are also zeroed, right? Well, they are zeroed at a certain distance, right? And usually what they're coming from the factory is like 25, 35 yards or something like that. So
Okay.
if you're shooting at 10 yards or 7 yards, right, you might have a holdover or hold under based on those iron sights. So if you're picking something like, hey, I'm going to zero my red dot at 10 yards, and I'm just going to slave my dot to my irons, so just drifting the dot over until it's kind of lollipopped on my irons, that's not necessarily going to give you good results, right? Because you don't know where the iron sights were actually zeroed from, and they might be off, right? Iron sights aren't necessarily always on. A lot of guns have adjustable sights, things like that. So it's always good to separate those two things, zero the red dot independently of the irons, and then if you want to know where your irons are hitting, turn the red dot off or turn the brightness down and shoot the irons by themselves. Figure out where your holds need to be for there. So that's the first thing I would say.
I'm glad you brought that up. There's a lot of instances where people get really wrapped up in the term co-witnessing and all that other stuff. I think, co-witnessing, if your iron sights happen to do it, I think that's cool, but we need to really look at the iron sighting system and the red dot sighting system as two completely individual sighting systems. And when you start trying to, it's almost like when people are trying to use, MOA and inches at the same time. You're trying to use two very different types of measurement systems at the same time. Same thing, if you're trying to use two different aiming systems at the same time together and they're not really meant to be used that way, it starts to get all gobbledygook and you wind up chasing your tail and getting frustrated.
Exactly. So there's that, right? Separate the aiming systems. The next thing I'm going to look at is what distance do I want to actually zero my red dot at? So there are a couple considerations for this. I would say that the most common pistol zero distances would be 10 yards, 15 yards, or 25 yards.
Okay.
I would equate that to like the 36, the 50, and the 100-yard zero for rifles, right? I'll just cut right to the chase and say that your pistol zero doesn't matter if you can't shoot, right? So if you can't group well, or if you can't remember holds and things like that, it really doesn't matter, right? But there are some advantages and disadvantages of the different distances. So what I would say is at 25 yards, you're going to kind of have an overall flatter trajectory, right? So 25 yards is oftentimes kind of the farther, getting close to that farther limit of what people intend to do with pistols, right? And so anything inside of that, right, you have kind of a diminishing return as far as how much hold over, hold under you need to apply, right? The problem with that is a lot of people can't group well enough at 25 yards to get a group to where they can actually dial in that zero and make it really precise. Right. So that's where 15 and 10-yard zeros come in. Personally, I'm a pretty big fan of the 10-yard zero. So I can group a lot better at 10 yards. I shoot a little bit more consistently at 10. But what I'm looking for is a really small group at 10, right?
Yeah.
People talk a lot about, I zero my pistol at 10 yards and then I confirm at 25. Right? And what I think a lot of people end up doing is they zero their pistol at 10, and then they go back to 25, and they adjust their zero, and now they have this loose zero at 25.
It's kind of not really anything at that point.
Right. So like what I would be looking for is, hey, if you zeroed at 10, but you want to see how you're performing at 25, you should be looking for what's the difference in my point of aim, point of impact, and also making corrections for windage. Right, but I'm not going to make corrections for elevation because I'm going to understand that if I have a 10-yard zero at 25 yards, I'm going to be hitting high. So I'm going to need to hold it a little bit low. I have a couple targets here. So a lot of times I'll see people zeroing on like a B8 target like this. Not necessarily the best zero target because the XRing is actually pretty large, especially for 10 yards. But for 25 yards, it's acceptable. With a 10-yard zero for me, if I'm impacting right here, right on the X, right, and I move back to 25 yards, my rounds tend to hit kind of top of the 9 ring. Okay.
Okay.
So for me, I have to hold low at kind of the bottom of the 9 ring, and I expect to hit impacting the X ring if I do everything correctly. What I would be looking for, though, is at 10 yards, it's much more difficult or it's a lot easier to kind of keep a tight group. At 25, if I'm seeing some significant spread, kind of deviation this way, left and right with my windage, that might be something I might correct, because I might not be picking up that error at 10 yards just because of how short of a distance I have.
Yeah, that makes sense. That little bit of error proliferates, there's a hell of a word for you, a little bit more over that longer distance. It's funny, I mean, the distances we're talking about, 25 is this longer distance. Of course, it's so short in other circumstances.
Right.
But I think what you're saying totally makes a lot of sense. And shooting that tight group at 10 yards is, I mean, that's key to everything. It's key to any time that you're sighting in a firearm. You should be trying to shoot as best as you possibly can, because anything else that you do after that is not going to be it likely won't be in as nice and controlled of an environment, whether it's a competition or, in the case of some hunting scenario, or in the case of some home defense, concealed carry, tactical scenario, it's not going to be as nice and controlled. So you want to have all the advantage and all the potential accuracy sort of eked out of the system as you possibly can right there.
Definitely. But at the same time, I would also encourage people to think about the application of the firearm that they're shooting, right? So if I'm zeroing a precision long gun and I am zeroing, like a bolt gun, right? I want to have a really, really tight group, because if I'm zeroing at 100 yards, when we get to 1,000, obviously that group size is going to be magnified, right? Mm-hmm. So I want to make sure that group is really, really small. With pistols, again, I mean, can you shoot pistols past 25 yards? Of course, right? 40, 50, even 100 yards, you can still hit things, right? But we're not usually as concerned about group size with pistols as we are with like a precision rifle or even an AR-15, right? So what I'm concerned about more is knowing exactly where I need to hold in order to hit a certain spot, more so than can I hit the X-ring every time from every single distance, right?
Sure.
So pistols, generally, you're either shooting competition with them, perhaps, or you're shooting, maybe you carry concealed, or maybe it's a home defense weapon, right? If you've got a difference of a couple of inches, just like you would on a carbine, that is less of a concern to me as far as, hey, I was aiming here and I hit a little bit low based on the distance. Less concerning to me than being able to put the bullets exactly where you want them. So being able to hold your dot where you want it, pull the trigger without moving the sights off of that. If I'm impacting a little bit low, say an inch low based on distance to the target, not as big of a deal as it is with something like precision shooting.
Makes
right?
total sense.
At the same time, if I'm not confident in the zero of my gun, and I go to shoot something like a USPSA match, that could affect me, right? Shooting a head box at 15 yards, something small the size of a credit card at 10 yards, right? I might need to know my holds. But it's just something to take into consideration.
Right. It needs to be a good enough group that you can actually deduce something from it.
Absolutely.
When you're shooting and you're at, even if you're the kind of shooter where you're maybe newer to shooting pistols, or you're still kind of honing in your skills, and you're at 10 yards and you're shooting kind of this big mess that you can't really figure out an average, like, oh yeah, I can see that they're low and to the right or something like that, that becomes pretty difficult, because that's where you start to lose some of that confidence in, well, if I make an adjustment, did I make the right adjustment? Which one was a flyer here? Which one was actually, a good trigger press and all that stuff?
And so that's why something like a 10-yard zero can come in really helpful.
Yeah.
Right? Or be very handy, because at 10 yards, it might be a little bit easier for you to actually print a good group on paper. One thing to consider, though, is like if you're using something like a B8, I think the scoring rings on a B8 are fairly large for like a 10-yard zero, right? For a 25-yard zero, if I'm stacking groups of 5 into the X-ring, I'm pretty happy with that, personally, based on my level of skill.
You're also a firearms instructor, Brennan. You get
True,
lots of
true. So I might be able to practice that more than other people, right?
Well, see, because I'm not. I'm just the guy who interviews the instructors, and I'm thinking to myself, 25 yards, I'm trying to fit everything in the X-ring.
At 25 yards, I would say if your group tends to be like 8-ring or bigger, that's not a good zero distance for you, because you might put one here, you might put one here, you might put one here, right? And it's just kind of all over. I have a hard time adjusting that group based off of something as big as an 8-ring on a B8. So if we're shrinking that distance down to 10 yards, though, I still want to keep that into consideration. That X-ring is still fairly large for 10 yards, depending on your level of skill. I wouldn't be happy with just anything kind of close to the X-ring at 10 yards. being a good 0. Right, and that's where that confirming at 25 might come in. But if I'm shooting at 10 yards, I might do something with a slightly different target or a slightly modified target where I put a 1-inch paster on my target. And so instead of now just holding myself to the XRing, I'm actually shrinking the size of that aiming point by about 2/3, and now I'm using something a little bit more refined. If I can be stacking them in that paster at 10 yards, slow fire, prepping the trigger, all of that, in my favor, then I can be more confident of my 0 and where that group is actually printing on paper, and hopefully do the math, translate that back to 25, and be printing a group that is proportionate to my 10-yard 0.
That is one of the nice things. I do like this, and it's also for the visual aspect of it, because like this B8 doesn't have a white X ring. It actually has a black X ring like the 10 and the 9 rings too. And so it just gives you that little more contrast. I don't know what it is with my eyes. I got LASIK, so I've got laser vision, but at the same time still, I don't have very good, I can't get contrast super good at distance.
Right.
So I can see this white on black really well, or this one where it has the white X ring. And it's funny too, when you make that even smaller and you give yourself something to focus on that's even smaller than the X ring, I almost feel like that helps me shoot a little bit better group because I'm focused. Maybe I'm getting into that whole Patriot aim small, miss small thing, Maybe I think there might be some truth to that.
There's a lot of truth to that, right? And so if we give ourselves a 0 target, can I 0 on this X ring? 100%, right? I could look at the letter X right in the middle and try to put bullet holes touching that letter, right? But sometimes it's hard for me to pick that out, and I just start seeing red near-ish the center of the target.
Yeah.
Not necessarily good enough for a pistol 0.
Do you, when it comes to actually shooting, do you prefer, I'm going to ask you this because I've seen you 0 a pistol before, so I know what you like to do, but when you shoot a pistol and when you 0, you're obviously comfortable enough in your fundamentals and things like that where you're freestyling it, right? Mm-hmm. Standing up at 10 yards, presenting the pistol and shooting, and you're 0ing that way. Is there ever any reason where somebody, say, who is maybe newer to shooting pistols, still kind of working things out, is there ever a reason where maybe they should try sitting at a bench of some sort and using a rest for their hand to try and, obviously they want to work those fundamentals and get better, but at least that can get them to the point where, okay, I've got a really solid 0 because I'm helping myself with some of that wobble zone, things like that. I'm eliminating a few variables. I get that good 0, and now I take the training wheels off, and now I'm going to train, but I'm training, even though maybe I'm not very good yet, I'm at least training with a good 0. Is there any advantage to that, or do you think that that's too much training wheel?
So I think it depends a little bit. I think if you are really new and you just need to get your pistol 0'd so that you can train, right? I think that if that is the best way, or maybe the only way, I should say the only way that you can print a consistent group on paper, then that might be a good way for you to do it. However, if you can print a consistent group but it's large, so let's say you can print a group, let's say the size of, maybe yay big, maybe half the size, maybe the size of the 10 ring,
the size of the base of a cupcake.
Sure, yeah, that's a great. Everybody knows what a cupcake size is, right? So let's say you have a group like that, right, and it's up here. I can still make adjustments on that and bring you down and to the right. Right, so I can still make it a lot closer, and then if you're centering up your group near the middle of the target, that's probably fine. There might be some micro adjustments in there that you would ideally like to make, and you might notice those later as you get better at them. But if you're, for the most part, pretty centered up with multiple groups, I would say that's fine. There are some things. There's a couple of trains of thought. Some people believe that benching a pistol changes enough about the way you would normally shoot a pistol that it doesn't give you an accurate 0. So some people believe in shooting only 0ing rifles from the prone. Some people think the bench is just as good. Some things, kind of really nuanced things, right?
Yeah.
I say with pistols, you can bench it if you want to. I would just not rely on that to be kind of the measure of whether or not your gun is zeroed. At the end of the day, you still have to be able to point your gun at the target, press the trigger, and get the bullet to go close to where you're aiming.
Right, that makes sense.
So if you can't print a consistent group, sure, bench it maybe, and if you're getting a consistent group that way, that'll give you a way to get kind of a rough zero. But if you can print consistent groups, even if they're larger, I would say just go ahead and freestyle it. The main thing there is just a good understanding of the fundamentals, just being able to like hold the dot still enough, right? Prep that trigger and then just press it really easy. Let the gun recoil. You're not focused on recoil control. You're not focused on speed. You're just letting the gun go off.
Yeah.
Right. And if you can do that, I think you can zero.
And this is something anyone can do. Yeah. And I think it's always made me want to tear my hair out, especially as I've hung out down here more when I am talking about, oh, yeah, like work down at a range, we have these instructors, we put on pistol classes, and the first thing you hear somebody is, oh, I suck at shooting with a pistol. And then they've written it off already in their head. They're like, nope, can't do it. And they act like pistol shooting, it might as well be closing your eyes and throwing a dart at the wall or something like that. But we see people all the time come through our intro to pistol classes, and they are shooting from 7-10 yards. Just they're getting hundreds, 10 shots, 10 out of 10, all within the 10 ring. And it's quite impressive what someone can do when they just apply some fundamentals. That's all it takes.
Yep.
And
I think it's important perspective to remember as well. Like, it's really easy to get kind of down in the weeds or down the rabbit hole of chasing your zero, chasing a perfect group, things like that. I know that happens to me, especially with rifles. I'm like, man, all the rounds weren't touching, and so now I'm mad, right? Doesn't have to be that way, especially for pistols. And at the end of the day, man, like, if you are shooting a target like this from 10 yards, 15 yards, and you are keeping them all in that 10 ring, like, you're doing really well. And for pistol applications, for the most part, I have not run into an application yet where being able to stack 10 rounds in the 10 ring at 10 yards is going to be this huge limiter on your performance or your abilities.
Right. Now, one thing I think that we see from time to time with people who are zeroing a red dot on a pistol, they run into a couple of issues. And I think it can be related to some of the stuff we were just talking about with maybe their understanding of the fundamentals and maybe their understanding of how to shoot a pistol and all that. Like, for example, say you're shooting a group and you start and you're shooting right-handed shooter shooting really low left. And you're adjusting and you're like, man, this sight that I just slapped on this pistol is way off. And you're adjusting so much you run out of adjustment. The red dot literally cannot adjust anymore. So then you have to go online and you have to buy this candid shim that's going to shim your red dot up so that you can get even more adjustment available. And you're doing all this crazy stuff until you can finally actually get it to the point where it's at least approaching the XRing. That, I think, how often, Brendan, have you seen it where actually legitimately you're running out of adjustment with a red dot on a pistol because of mechanical reasons with the red dot to gun matchup?
Never.
Right.
Never, right? So what's interesting about people is that...
There's a lot. There's a lot to unpack
many
there.
Interesting things about people. Right-handed shooter shooting low left, right? Yeah. Super common thing. Generally, it is... generally, that's caused by people pushing or influencing the gun in a certain way. What we see a lot in classes, and we have drills that try to kind of work this out for people, people just have no idea that they're actually doing that. And so they'll be aiming their gun and be like, yeah, I see my red dot right in the center of the target. Looks good to go. All right. And then something clicks off in their brain to where they go, now I'm just going to stop aiming and I'm going to forget about what is going to go on because I have to put all of my energy into thinking about pressing the trigger, right? And their sights will move off target, off of where they were intending to aim.
Very last second.
And it's just it's a fraction of an instant in time. Their brain kind of shuts off and stops processing that, hey, my sight is no longer where I wanted it to be. And they will sometimes people will influence the gun in exactly the same way every single time, right?
Yeah, they're actually remarkably consistent.
Remarkably consistent. They might have a really tight group because somehow they are pushing that gun in exactly the same way every single time. And so then they go, well, yeah, I have to hold my dot high and right because I always impact low and left. And there's things you can do for that, mixing in dummy rounds, things like that. Dry firing is a good way to get rid of that habit. But yeah, it's surprising how consistent someone can be with a mistake and think that it's a red dot problem. Personally, I have never had a red dot that even remotely ran out of adjustment. I'm not saying it can't happen, and maybe you got a lemon or something like that. Maybe it's happened to you, but I've never seen that happen for any of the dots that I have or any of the dots that we run in class,
right?
Or have seen in class.
Well, oftentimes too, I mean, when you think about the total amount of travel, I'm not going to try and list one off the top of my head because I don't know. There's so many numbers with all the optics that we have. But when you think of the total amount of travel on a red dot, that is a ton. And if you are maxing that out to the point where you need to get a shim to even further add in more adjustment, I mean, you got to realize that either there's something that you should be able to visually see wrong with the gun and optic and the way that they're matched up, or there could be something else going on there, because that shouldn't be the case. And so, how do you, Brennan, how do you approach that? I know sometimes I've seen you guys where, you're dealing with a student. I say dealing with as though they're a problem, but you're just interacting. You're interacting with a student who's just seeing that occur, right? In our intro to pistol classes, we actually provide the guns with the red dot on top, and usually I believe those just start out sighted in at that point, right?
Yeah.
And so the student seeing that consistent low left, or if they're a lefty, maybe they're seeing consistent low right, perhaps. But they're seeing that consistently pop up, and they're like, man, there's got to be something going on here. There's an element of sometimes you actually have to stick it out and not make adjustments with your optic to really, really, really focus on the fundamentals to actually see, maybe if I take a shot and I pay attention, I'm using my sight to see where that red dot is when the shot breaks. Maybe if I pay attention to that, I might actually see a big change in where my rounds are impacting on the target, and I didn't even touch the sight.
100%, right? So anytime we approach zeroing for any gun, what you'll hear like the edge instructors say a lot is, all right, man, that's a decent group, but I don't want to make any adjustments based off of that group yet because I think it's a little inconsistent, right? Mm-hmm. Or I might have the suspicion maybe they're shooting one of our guns, and I know that it's zeroed because I just zeroed it 10 minutes ago. I might say, you know what? Yeah, maybe the gun came unzeroed for some reason, but we're gonna wait. Let's keep working through some of these fundamentals and see what happens, right? And a lot of times this happens with students' guns. They come for pistol one or something, and it's all day he's shooting left, right? And then I might, if after a while that hasn't worked out, right, with more practice, I might say, hey, let me see that gun, right? I'll see it and I'll shoot it, and oh my gosh, it is shooting left, right? So then I might make an adjustment for them or help them make that adjustment. But usually that is not the case. I would say maybe 2 or 3% of the time you run into something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, at the time, I feel like, when you're dealing with adjusting an optic, it's never something you want to be doing a lot, unless you're shooting long range at like a bunch of varying distance targets or something like that. Right. But when we're talking about, a pistol or an AR-15, these things that are kind of meant to be a little more set it and forget it. I get that sometimes, the AR might be another story, but with the pistol, certainly it's kind of, wants to be one of those things where you want to be like, yeah, I said it and I forget it. If you're kind of, all right, I just got up here, bang, bang, bang. Oh, I don't like that. I'm going to adjust the sight. And then bang, bang, bang. Okay, now I'm going on along the day, and now my rounds seem to be not impacting the same spot anymore. I'm going to adjust it again. You don't want to really be chasing your tail around, always doing adjustments, because there is so much that can happen with that pistol out in front of you, and you have all these different parts of your body that all articulate and can make really tiny little adjustments that would throw it off. It's so important to really work on yourself before you start chasing your tail with all the mechanical pieces.
Definitely. I mean, I think the thing to remember is guns, if they're from like a reputable manufacturer, even maybe the ones that aren't, right, are way more accurate than you are. So understanding that the gun as like a machine or a tool does its thing over and over, and it does it really well, mechanically much more accurate than I could be. Right, and then understanding the way red dots are designed, and if they're mounted correctly, being solidly attached to that gun, right, that system in and of itself is a very accurate mechanical system. What's not accurate is a human body, right? Exactly. So most of the error or the deviation that we see when we shoot is based off of just what we're doing. And that takes a lot of practice to get super consistent. That's what all good shooters are chasing, is consistency.
For sure.
Yep.
I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing, going way back to the mechanical side of things. Sorry, we were talking about shooting. Now I'm gonna switch gears on you again. But we mentioned mounting the optic to the pistol. We mentioned, utilizing, maybe you use a little bit of thread locker or something compound to keep those screws from backing back out. Mounting the red dot to the gun itself, there are torque specs as well. I think you alluded to this, or at least you alluded to making sure that you read the instructions. As much as I know many of the listeners out there, you're the kind of folks who like to say, instructions, I don't need them.
I've been guilty of that.
Right. Those torque specs can be very important, just as they are with rifle scopes.
Super important.
And I bring this up because you're mentioning how, this is a tool, this is a machine that we're using in our hands. It's something that's going to be going through recoil and all these things, and so it can oftentimes be the tendency for someone to be like, well, if it's going through all that, man, I'm gonna tighten this thing down until there's no tomorrow. That way it ain't ever coming loose. That may actually cause issues too.
Yes.
So if you are seeing some of these big inconsistencies, that's what makes zeroing. I used to think like zeroing was kind of cool, and I'm like, yeah, it's necessary, but it always kind of, I don't love doing it, because especially with a new gun and a new optic, because you're like, man, I'm just diving into all these potential variables where, especially if I mounted it up myself and I've got this gun, boy, especially if I put the gun together myself, there's so many variables going on. So as long as with the mechanical side, if you follow all the instructions, then hopefully you can just have eliminated all those variables before you get to the range. That's such a more comfortable feeling when you know the mechanical side of things is functioning the way that it should. Going back to the part where we're more than likely going to be the source of any inaccuracies and things. That can be actually a little comforting.
Yeah.
Because then you're like, this thing works, time to work on me.
100%. And that's why I think that's the whole importance of having a good zero to begin with is, hey, I trust this thing works. So everything that I'm doing at the range, working on stuff, is literally just working on me and my skills. And the gun's going to do what it's supposed to do. I just have to let it do it, right?
Right. Absolutely.
100%.
Is there anything we missed about zeroing a pistol with a red dot the right way?
So what I would say is there's a thing. So there's a thing that we like to use with optics, especially I like to use it, called witness marking your screws, right? So anytime I attach hardware to a gun, let's say I attach like a weapon mounted light to a rifle or something, I will use like a little paint pen a lot of times to mark on the screw and then on the actual hardware, the mounting hardware itself, where that screw was after I've torqued it to spec, okay? That way, if I see those two paint lines offset from each other, I know that my screws have moved. So also a really good way to kind of keep track of your zero is to witness mark your adjustments on your red dot itself. Some people don't like to do that because it looks kind of funky, or you have white paint pen marks on your optic. But I do think it's smart to do, especially if it's a gun that you rely on for home defense or concealed carry. I think it's a good idea to do. The other thing is, keep in mind that different ammos will zero differently. So you will have point of aim, point of impact shifts depending on a ton of different factors, bullet weight, the amount of powder in that charge, things like that. So there are times when I'll be shooting my competition loads, which is like 150 grain Syntech. So it's a very specific round designed for competition. And then I'll be shooting my defensive ammo, which I shoot gold dot 124 grain plus P. So it's a spicier round. It's a lighter bullet. Those two rounds behave significantly differently. Even at 10 yards, I'm getting a significant difference. And when I say significant, for me, the shift is a little bit of elevation, and I would say it's enough to where if I was aiming at an XRing, it would put me on the edge of the 10 ring. Right, at 10 yards.
Okay.
So I'm
glad you brought this up.
Fairly specific. So what I like to do is, again, if you have a gun that you train with, maybe shoot a lot. Maybe you buy cheap ammo because honestly, that's what everybody's after, is the cheapest ammo they can find. But then you have good quality tested defensive ammo in your gun for carrier home defense. I'm going to make 2 separate witness marks in 2 different colors on that screw so that I can adjust my 0 to my range ammo and then readjust it back to my carry ammo. Is that completely necessary? I don't think it's completely necessary, because even in the case of, the ammo that I was talking about, we're talking about maybe an 1.5 inch difference, right? And so if you think about like a defensive scenario, 1.5 inches on a human body, maybe not.
At 10 yards.
At 10 yards, right? Really probably not that big of a deal. You're probably going to be freaked out enough to be yanking the gun all around and maybe even missing your target completely. So 1.5 inches, is it that big of a deal? Maybe not. But God forbid there's a situation where you do need to make a very precise shot. Man, I'd sure want to know that my 0 is on. So that's one of those things. It's just a tool. If you want to use it, witness mark it for the range ammo that you use, witness mark it for the defensive ammo you use. And if you decide to start over or you change ammos, just get some rubbing alcohol out, wipe those marks off, and start over.
I'm glad you brought that one up. I forgot about that because, I think that's something a lot of people forget about, because when you talk long-range precision, everybody gets all real worked up over the ammo that they're shooting, and it has to be super consistent. Everything has to be perfect. And then you step kind of down to carbines. When I say step down, I'm talking about usually the distance that you're shooting. Not that carbines can't shoot far. But, and it's kind of like, all right, yeah, now I'm training with FMJ. I'm shooting on a 50-yard range and all that stuff. And you kind of start to pay a little less attention to what you're feeding it. And then by the time you're at pistol, you're so close in range and you're thinking like, man, yeah, all 9 mil is the same. Just feed this anything. I can feed it a party mix in the magazine. And it's, there's that general sense. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it can make a difference. And I would say, like you said, you've kind of taken it to the extreme where you do make those slight tweaks if you're using the gun for different purposes with the different ammo, But if you are going to use the gun, if it's primarily a range toy and you're buying Hornady XYZ FMJ ammo, and then you decide for whatever reason, and now I'm going to grab all this bulk ammo and from Federal or something like that, but you're still going to shoot competition with it or something, you may want to just recheck that 0 if you're going to do a big old change.
Yep, I just do a quick confirmation and then call it good, right? The witness marking is probably not the move if you shoot a ton of different ammos all the time, or you buy ammo in small quantities and things like that. But for us, generally, for like our 9mm load that we shoot here, we generally shoot a lot of the same type, so it makes sense. And then I always carry the same defensive ammo. The other thing you can do is you can just witness mark where your defensive ammo hits, and then just adjust off of that, and then adjust back once you're done for the day.
Makes sense.
Yep.
I like it. Again, thanks for bringing that up. That was a good one.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot here, but inevitably there may be questions. So you can hit us up in the comments or over on Instagram, all that good stuff. Maybe we'll hear from Brennan again. I actually think that we will, because we plan on doing a lot more podcasts, and Brennan does pretty good at these, I think. Unless you guys think otherwise. You should also comment down below if you think Brennan really did terrible. All right. Anyway, thanks everybody, though, for watching this one. We appreciate you tuning in to the Vortex Edge podcast. We'll see you on the next one. Bye. That's a wrap, everybody. Hope you liked this topic. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and of course, subscribe right here, because there's going to be plenty more to come. If there's topics you'd like to hear us go over on the Vortex Edge podcast in the future, you can let us know by commenting below or hitting us up on Instagram, which is @Vortex Edge. We'd love to hear your suggestions so we can be bringing you the kind of episodes and topics that you want to hear. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you on a future episode. Thanks again for watching, everybody. Bye.